And I'm going to pass it off right away to Jessy Han, and she will talk about a causal framework to evaluate racial bias in law enforcement systems.
Hello, okay. Hi everyone, I'm Jessy Xinyi Han. I am a fifth-year PhD student at MIT, my research interests are in using causal inference and other machine learning models to help decision-making in criminal justice and healthcare. So today I'll be presenting our work on a causal framework to evaluate racial disparities in the law enforcement system. And this work is done in collaboration with these amazing researchers, Professor Andrew Miller, Craig Watkins, my co-advisor, Professor Fotini Christia, Professor Christopher Winship, and my advisor, Professor Devavrat. So I'd like to start my presentation with the story of Professor Henry Louis Gates, who is a fellow colleague of one of our co-authors at Harvard. Professor Gates was arrested at his own home while he was trying to open the jammed front door. A neighbor walking by saw this suspicious activity of a Black person trying to break into a house. They immediately called 911. The police later arrived and arrested Professor Gates, despite his explanation that he lived there and had just returned from the trip. So although this case was eventually dropped, resolved with charges dropped, it brings a very important point, which is often missing in the conversation of racial bias in the criminal justice system. That is, the bias can enter the system not just through policing actions, but it can actually happen even way before that, through the 911 reporting of the general public. So the case of Professor Gates is just one of the millions of incidents in the criminal justice system. And all these kind of incidents start with a victim or a witness calling 911 for help. And the police, the call taker may decide on whether to dispatch the police or not. And later, the police arrive at the scene. They may arrest someone suspicious, and the suspects will later be brought to the judges for trials and later stages as well. So of course, the victim or witness can also directly approach the police for help, and the police can also just self-initiate the stops when they are patrolling on street. However, 911 calls are a major source of the stops compared to the other two ways of stops. And so, for example, in New York City, between 2018 and 2020, more than half of the stops are initiated by 911 calls in the first place. So with this flow chart in mind, and also the important point that the 911 calls are important gateways to police-civilian interactions, we propose this multi-stage causal framework to understand the racial disparities in the system. So this framework incorporates different stages like 911 reporting, police dispatching, stopping, and the later outcomes like use of force or arrests or other things. One thing to know here is that we incorporate the notion of true criminality here, in the sense that the criminal justice system should hold people accountable for the crimes they commit, but should also set the innocent people away from incarceration. However, we assume that given the context, a person's race does not determine whether he or she is a criminal or not. And this is the key assumption we stand by. So with this causal deck, we can now move on to define what we mean by racial parity. And we shall do so stage by stage. So first, parity in reporting is defined as the counterfactual equality in the reporting while controlling for criminality and context. And similarly, the parity in law enforcement is defined as a counterfactual equality in use of force while controlling for reported criminality and context. And given the DAG and do calculus, we can identify the causal quantities and represent them using statistical quantities here. However, one challenge here to evaluate these quantities is that criminality is generally not observed, or it's not even recorded in any data sets. So what should we do? Probably we can turn to another definition of racial parity, and I promise you I will circle back to explain how the new definition is related to these two here. So the new notion is called observational racial disparity in law enforcement, which is defined as the delta being the difference in the likelihood of being subject to use of force between a reported majority and a reported minority. Note here that the criminality variable is gone, so this is totally evaluable with real-world data. To further discern the likelihood of use of force for criminals and for innocents, we can split this likelihood into two. So one for criminal here and one for innocent. And since the criminals and the innocents are in the conditional, so we need to reweigh these two quantities here so that they match with the original likelihood. And the weights are exactly the ratio of the criminal in the reported group and also the ratio of the innocent people in the reported group. I'm not sure if you noticed, but the left column match exactly with the definitions in parity in policing I just mentioned in the previous slide. And the right column are equivalent definitions of parity in 911 reporting, also mentioned in previous slide. And of course, we can simplify this maybe just by a little, since the ratio of the innocent plus the ratio of the criminal should be equal to 1. Yeah, so I have just walked you through, I guess, the major points of our main theorem. And for more rigorous proof and details, feel free to refer to our paper. Yeah, so we have been focusing extensively on daily policing, like police and civilian interactions. But there are, in fact, many different ways of policing. And I'll show you that they actually match exactly with different regimes of this parameter here, which is the ratio of the innocent people in the reported group. So first, let's take a look at airport security checks. So I guess a lot of us, including me, took a plane here. So I guess most of us probably are not trying to sneak in anything illegal when we are stopped at the airport for security checks. So this matches with a regime where the innocence ratio in the reported group is close to 1. And in this case, so if we see observational bias against the minority group people in real-world data, then based on the framework and the calculation, the primary source of such bias should be coming from racial bias in policing against minority innocents. And second case is AI-empowered policing. And this probably will not happen until a future that is far, far away from now. So where in that world, like maybe AI algorithms are really good at detecting suspects, that they never make any errors. And in that sense, the innocence ratio should be close to 0. And in that case, if we see observational bias against minority, then the bias of the primary source of the bias should be the racial bias in policing against minority criminals. And now we can return to our previous conversation of police-civilian interactions, the daily policing. And we'll be applying our causal framework to real-world data from New York City and New Orleans. And we'll be using data from 911 calls and stop, question, and frisk data. So we concatenate the two data sets together to have an overview picture of the multi-stage criminal justice system. And for the time being, I will just only highlight the most important results, and feel free to refer to the paper for more details. So first, for New York City, so I plotted all the observational racial disparity based on the real-world data for different precincts in New York City. And we see that all of them are showing this observational racial disparity against the minority. And based on the framework, there are two possible examinations. So one is that the bias is coming from the racial bias in 911 reporting against the majority, which doesn't sound really convincing. So the other possible explanation is that the primary source of such bias is coming from the racial bias in policing against the minority people. And for New Orleans, we are seeing something different. So we are, again, plotting the observational racial disparity using real-world data for different precincts. And we see that a majority of the precincts are exhibiting observational racial disparity against majority, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive in the first place. And there are, again, possible explanations. So one is that such bias is primarily coming from racial bias in policing against majority. We can either take this as the explanation, or we can turn to another possibility, which is that the primary source of such bias is in racial bias in 911 reporting against minority people. And in other words, the counterintuitive result of this observational racial disparity against majority might be coming because the general public are disproportionately reporting the minority group of people. Maybe because they find something suspicious or something else. And just like the case I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, the arrest of Professor Gates. So if we take this as our possible conclusion, then we can turn to possible policy reforms like educational programs advocating for more awareness about the prejudice against minority people. So the takeaway message here is that we propose this multi-stage causal framework to understand the racial disparities from a systematic perspective. And by discerning the primary source of such bias, we can guide better or more meaningful policy reforms. And moreover, we expect such kind of multi-stage causal framework can be applied not only just in law enforcement, but also in other AI-empowered multi-stage systems. For example, like I think some people mentioned about recruiting in previous talks. So a lot of times, the minority people, they have, or underrepresented group of people, they have less access to job postings in the first place, so that they are less likely to apply, not to mention about the biased resume screening or interviewing or later stage recruitment. So I'd like to use the, last few minutes to highlight my two other work in progress projects related to criminal justice. So again, we are seeing this flow chart of the life cycle of incidents in the criminal justice system. But the work I just talked about focus on the first few stages, but there are other works. For example, we're focusing on the effect of body on camera on police-civilian interactions. And also we have another work trying to understand the racial bias in time to recidivism. And specifically, nowadays, the police departments are using risk assessment algorithms to help them predict who they can release, who they should keep in prison. And such bias or algorithms are usually biased against minority people. And we want to understand, apart from the algorithm analysis attributing to the racial disparities in time to recidivism. And also, we just started open data initiative at MIT, trying to collect data sets that can be used to understand racial bias. And now we are focusing on criminal justice data sets like 911 reports, police civilian interaction data sets like stop, question, frisk data sets, and also criminal justice records data. But we look forward to extending it to other fields like housing, education, and more. So if you have questions or you're interested in collaborating in this open data initiative, feel free to email me. And this is the QR code to our paper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessy. I think we have time for one question, if anyone has one. I see over here.
So you pointed out that the data you observed, say, in New Orleans, could be consistent with police bias against the majority group, which I'm assuming meant white people in this context, or sort of 911 call bias against the minority group. And you said, you know, your prior, which also matches my prior, is that one of those two is more likely. But I'm wondering, is there any sort of, have you given thought to like a data-driven way that you could try to disentangle those two hypotheses?
Yes, so I think maybe one next step is just collect more detailed reports on the 911 part. So maybe we not only look at I guess the results, whether the dispatcher decide to dispatch the police or not. We also look at the actual context of the phone calls, like what the like the scripts, like how did people describe in their 911 reports, and also like what is the end result of those cases? Did they end up finding someone suspicious or not? So I think that will give us more clear answer to, or like more evidence on like whether the 911 reporting against minority people is indeed the more likely explanation. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jessy. Let's thank our speaker one more time. And where's the next talk?